Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature in the University of Calcutta. Today we will discuss types of translation, a module from translation studies paper, and the content of this module is developed written by Anshika Adhikari. Let us start with an introduction of types of translation, that how many types of translation we practice and we discuss in theory. The practice of translation is quite long established, but the discipline of translation studies is fairly new. Earlier, it was simply kept within the bounds of a language learning activity. Roughly till 1960s, in the Europe, translation was merely a lesser tool to aid the language teachers in making their people learn modern language like English. In the 1960s, literary translation workshops were conducted in the USA, specifically in the Princeton and the Iowa University, which set the platform for the intellectual discussion on the theoretical aspects and details of translation studies as a discipline. Translation is a set of activities carried out by a translator to convert a source language text into a text of the target language. A source text is a text from which the ideas are drawn. Target text, on the other hand, is a translated text in which the intended text is translated. According to Jeremy Mundy, I quote, "The process of translation between two different written languages involves the translator changing an original written text, the source text, or we call it ST, in the original verbal language, the SL or SL, into a written text, the target text or TT, in a different verbal language, or TL or TL. I unquote. A Russian linguist Roman Jakobson distinguished three different types of translation in his seminal essay called On Linguistic Aspects of Translation. Interpretation of a verbal sign, according to Roman Jakobson, can happen in three ways. The first one is intralingual translation, the second one is interlingual translation, and the third one is intersemiotic translation. Now we'll define what is intralingual translation. Interlingual translation or rewording is an interpretation of verbal signs by means of other signs of the same language. In other words, it is putting meaning in different words. But while defining translation, scholars and theoreticians do not consider interlingual translation as a part of translation activity. Primarily, the focus is on interlingual translations. Even at the universities, students are primarily trained in interlingual translation. This is stimulating because the components of translation which a student learns to perform the activity of interlingual translation also influence the production of interlingual translation. Now, interlingual translation. Interlingual translation or translation proper is an interpretation of verbal signs by means of some other language. An example of interlingual translation would be the Bible. Assumed to be originally written in Hebrew, the Bible also underwent numerous translations into Greek and Latin and then into English. The King James Bible or the authorized version has primacy in English, but the language is antiquated and many people might find it difficult to follow. So at present there is the Good News Bible, which is the modern English version translated by the American Bible Society. Intersemiotic translation or transmutation is an interpretation of verbal signs by means of signs of non-verbal sign system, like novel to film or story to a play. Mona Baker argues that interlingual translation is not a subsidiary form of translation, as is the popular perception. She also points out that most of the translation in the Greek language was interlingual rather than interlingual, for the major work was that of modernizing ancient Greek text. In most of the ancient Sanskrit plays, there were at least 3 dialectical versions of pure Sanskrit in use, which required the audience to translate as he or she watched the play. This was an interlingual translation rather than interlingual translation. Translation can be typically divided into following binary types. 1. Literary translation and non-literary or informative translation. 2. Oral translation and written translation. 3. Human-assisted translation and computer-aided translation. Literary translation and non-literary translation. Literary translation can be defined or characterized in such way. Literary translation is recognized as a literary quest in itself. It includes translation of poetry, plays, literary books, literary text, as well as songs, rhymes, literary articles, fiction, novels, short stories, poems, etc. Style is the essential characteristic of every piece of writing. The outcome of the writer's personality and his emotions at the moment. A single paragraph cannot be put together without revealing to some degree the personality of the author. It depends on the following important factors which every translation should keep in mind when she or he is translating a text. The type of text being translated, the purpose of the translation, the intended audience, all these things should be kept into mind of a translator while he or she is translating. Every writer has a literary style and his style is reflected in his writing. There has been an ongoing debate about the style of a literary translation. Some authors and theoreticians say that a translated text must reflect the style of a translator, while the others maintain that the essence of the source text should be maintained in a translated text. A capable translator must be fully aware of the source text and source language and the target language and the target text. She or he must also be able to be in tune with the author of the source text, comprehend the cultural nuances of the author, and be skillful enough to apply appropriate method for translating a literary text. So you can understand that a translator should have very good grip on the target language. In fact, he or she must know target language better than the source language, because he or she has to create the text in a new form in the target language. The literary translator has to take into account the beauty of the text, its style, and the lexical, grammatical, and phonological features. Some of these may not be the same in the target language. The aim of the translator is that the quality of the translation be the same as the original text without leaving out any of the content. The text must be seen as an integral and coherent piece of work. For example, if we are translating from Hindi to English or vice versa, we must bear in mind that the two situations are quite non-identical. The culture of both the languages are very dissimilar, and sometimes this leads to a stark opposite views on certain issues. This makes the quest to find equivalence quite difficult. So the translated text should not follow the source text from word to word by word, because there are lots of problems with cultural equivalences, lots of problem with lexical equivalences. Then the target text should be a good reading, so the translator should keep it in mind while translating. Some concepts or characteristics might be unknown or not practiced in the other culture. The practice of literary translation has changed as a matter of globalization. Texts have become more exotic, and this translation should contribute to a better and more correct understanding of the source culture of a country. In poetry, In case of poetry, form is an essential to preserve as contents. Susan Bassnett McGuire says, I quote, "The degree to which the translator reproduces the form, meter, rhythm, tone, register, etc. of the source language text will be as much determined by the target language system and will also depend on the function of the translation. One of the more difficult things to translate is poetry. It is essential to maintain the flavor of the original text." So poetry translation is very difficult job, and many critic and the translator claims or says that the translation of poetry is not possible. As Newmark says, translation of poetry is an acid test showing the challenging nature of translating. In the translation of poetry, puns, allusions, analogies, alliterations, onomatopoeia, figures of speech, and metaphors become a challenge to translate. Arbery said that rhythm translation was comparable in an acrobatic performances to setting an elephant to walk a tightrope. This statement alone might suffice to show the difficulties inherent in performing such a task. Based on what we just discussed, it is assumed that although the translation of literary text in general and of poetry in particular seems a far-fetched challenge and in rare cases only possible with partial semantic and stylistic loss, it is by no means totally impossible. Evidence shows that a skilled translator with poetic taste can achieve this end with the necessary literary features and devices of the source text kept intact. For example, I can say about poet Jibanananda Das, a Bengali poet, and his famous translation of Bonlata Sen. While Clinton B. Seeley is translating his text, I mean the reader who has direct access to that Bengali text and the English text can easily understand that it is a wonderful translation and good reading as well the original text. Now I would like to talk about Andre Lefever's comment and ideas. Andre Lefever mentions 7 techniques appropriated by English translators in translating Catullus' poems. The poetry of Gaius Valerius Catullus was written towards the end of the Roman Republic. It describes the lifestyle of the poet and his friends. Phonemic translation attempts to reproduce the sounds of the source language in the target language, and at the same time the translator tries to transfer the meaning. According to Lefever, in general the result sounds awkward and sometimes leaves some parts of the original meaning behind. The metrical translation, which emphasizes the reproduction of the original meter into the target language. Because each language has its own specific stressing and pronunciation system, this method will result in the inappropriate translation in terms of meaning and structure. Next technique is poetry into prose, which captures the sense but the poetic qualities tend to get lost. Next is literal translation. Literal translation means word for word translation. This method will not be able to transfer the original meaning, while the phrase and sentence structures tend to fall by the wayside in the target language. Next is Rind translation, focuses on the transfer of the rhyme of the original poem into the translation in target language text. The result sometimes is phonemically sound but ends up being semantically absurd. So you can understand it is very difficult while we are translating some poem following the rhymed translation method. It is very difficult to keep semantic value and phonemic value simultaneously. The sixth method is free words translation. With this method, the translator may be able to get the accurate equivalence in the target language with the sound literary value of the result. As a result, rhyme and meter tend to get ignored. Therefore, the result is different from the original, but semantically it seems the same. The last method noted by Lefever is interpretation. Lefever categorizes it into two sections, in two categories. One is version and the second is imitation. A version of a poem in the target language will semantically be exactly the same with the original but physically totally different. Further, an imitation is exactly a different poem, but the title, topic and a starting point are the same with the original poem. Next, we'll discuss about non-literary or informative translation. Non-literary or informative translation is a type of translation which focuses on redirecting the meaning of the text without placing focus on word for word accuracy. In other words, it gives weight to the message of the source text. Non-literary translation is a good way of making summaries of text and highlighting the most important parts of the text. We have legal translation in this kind, and this kind of translation is very much important for our corporate translating, for translating advertisement, for translating legal notes or legal issues. So legal translation is an important type of a non-literary translation. Translating for legal equivalence is the production of translations that are acceptable by a legal jurisdiction. The procedure for translating to legal equivalence differs from country to country. There is a less documentation and even lesser translated text available in India. This may include legal documents such as summons and warrants, administrative text such as registration certificates, corporate status and remittance drafts, technical documents such as expert opinions and text for judicial purposes, and a number of other texts in addition to reports and minutes of court proceedings. I can tell you an interesting example of legal translation during the British colonization, when first Supreme Court of India established in 18th century in Calcutta. British tried to replace all the Persian legal words, and they tried to introduce Bengali equivalence or Sanskrit equivalence or English equivalence for those. So this is quite interesting episode of or a case for study of legal translation. Now we can talk about the technical translation. Technical translation is a type of translation which involves the translation of documents produced by technical writers. The texts are related to the technological subject areas which deal with the practical application of scientific and technological information. Some of the areas covered under technical translation are engineering specifications, marketing materials, technical proposals, users guides, multimedia audio and visual, guidebooks, websites, operating manuals, catalogs, e-learning, safety manuals, installation manuals, training materials. All these can be included as area of technical translation. Oral and written translation, the next topic we are going to discuss. In oral translation or interpretation, the interpreter listens to the oral presentation of the original and translate it as an oral message in target language. In other words, oral translation is a translation of sound in spoken language from source language to target language. Two main varieties of oral translation exist: consecutive and simultaneous. Both types are actively used when communication occurs at various levels, from official speeches to interpersonal communication. Next is consecutive translation. Consecutive translation is applied during seminars or business meetings where the groups are small and have to interact. They have to make presentations, visit to public notary offices, reaching specific business agreements and similar kind of thing. After addressing those present, the speaker makes a break to allow a translation of what has been said. It is usually performed by one interpreter. It is more suitable in a situation where there is smaller audience and interpretation into just one language is needed. The interpreter stands next to the speaker, takes notes of the presentation and interprets the speech after every 5 to 10 minutes. Speaking and interpreting take place in turns. Length of the original speech is an important factor during the process of consecutive translation. Here the interpreter strategy and the final results depend to a great extent on the length of the segment to be translated. If the segment is just a sentence or two, the interpreter closely follows the original speech. As often as not, however, the interpreter is expected to translate a long speech which has lasted for scores of minutes or even longer. To make this possible, the interpreter has to take notes of the original messages. The study of and practice in such notation is the integral part of the interpreter's training as a special exercise to develop his memory. This implies the ability to make a judgment on the relative value of various messages and to generalize or compress the received information. The interpreter must obviously be a capable and quick-witted thinker, and you know that such kind of translation is very important for diplomatic relationship, for taking interviews of talented person in their field who are coming for far land and less known linguistic community and don't have access to the target language of the audience. So in such cases, this type of translation is very much significant. Now next we will discuss the simultaneous translation. Simultaneous translation is applied during conferences, seminars, workshops and business meetings which include a larger number of participants. The presentation is conducted in a systematic manner with somewhat controlled interactivity and closeness and much faster than consecutive interpretation. For simultaneous interpretation, microphones, earphones and both are necessary technical equipment. Simultaneously interpreting requires special interpreting technology. The interpreter works in a soundproof room. He or she listens to the speaker through headphones and simultaneously interprets into the microphone. The audience can choose a suitable channel with the suitable language and listen to the speaker also through headphones. Now we come to written translation. Written translation is a reproduction of the content of the original document by means of the language of translation in a written form. The principal aims is to render a written translation of text and documents from source language text to target language text. A translator should be attentive about the following details to translate a text. Translation integrity, all the necessary details should remain intact. Translator should be concerned about accurate reproduction of content and terminology like equivalency and adequacy of translation, correct spelling and grammar, compliance with language standards, absence of misprints and other errors, including any spelling mistakes under undetectable by automatic means. Written translation is carried out either by human assisted translation or machine aided translation. The key skill of a good translator is the ability to write well and express oneself clearly in the target language. That is why professional translators almost always work in only one direction, translating only into their native language. Even bilingual individuals rarely can express themselves in a given subject equally well in two languages. And many excellent translators are far from being bilingual. The key skills of the translator are the ability to understand the source language and the culture of the country where the text originated, and using a good library of dictionaries and reference materials render that material into target language. Central to written translation are the following skills: the ability to comprehend written text in one language or reading skills, and the ability to produce a comparable rendition in written form in a second language or writing skills into another. Most professional translators provide only an unidirectional translation, as a rule working into their dominant language. Unlike spoken or signed language interpreters, translators often have the luxury of time and other resources to come up with the best way to capture the nuances of meaning in the original text. And you can easily understand that for a written translation, translator has enough time to consult encyclopedia, consult dictionaries, they have enough time to put footnote or glossary or endnote for the unknown terms or the non-equivalent words. Now let us discuss something about human assisted translation and machine aided translation or machine translation. Now first we discuss about the human translation. Human translation, although there are machines that can do translation, human translation is still the best form of translating any written document, be it books, legal documents, manuals, product information, websites, personal documents, magazines, letters and advertisements. It means that human translators carry out all the processes involved in the translation of written text. The process involves the work of a professional translator, usually a native speaker or one who he studied the translation target language extensively. The translators translate the original text into a version that captures the spirit and meaning of the original using the right tone and style suitable for the target reader of the translated text. Human language involves expressions, and in translation the meaningful context and sense of the phrases have to be considered when writing them in another language. Most words have several connotations and various senses, and these are to be considered when choosing the best style and word choices for the translation to be effected. As for example, French language has multiple connotations for a word, so the translator should be competent enough to translate from French to any other language or from any other language into French. So in such kind of translation, human translation is very much helpful or unavoidable. Now, even in English, there is a difference between turquoise and light blue, and pink is not simply a mixture of red and white. The choice of right words which will deliver the message is only possible through human assisted translation. Since there is no such thing as a single translation format for a document, it is up to the decisions made by the translator and his or her creativity that would ensure the accuracy of the translation. The accuracy and quality of human translation is impossible to achieve using a machine. It is a result of a systemic process and the application of the professional and specialized skills of the human translator who is capable of choosing the right alternatives. Now let us discuss about the machine translation. Machine translation, or popularly known as its abbreviation MT, is an automated translation. It is the process by which computer software is used to translate a text from one natural language such as Bangla to another such as English. To process any translation, human or automated, the meaning of a text in the original or source language must be fully restored in the target language, like the translation. While on the surface this seems simple, it is far more complicated. Machine translation requires extensive expertise in grammar, syntax or sentence structure, semantics or meanings, etc. in the source and target language, as well as familiar with each local region. So you can understand that we need very much developed software to use for machine translation. Now we will discuss a rule-based machine translation technology. Rule-based machine translation relies on countless built-in linguistic rules and millions of bilingual dictionaries for each language pair. The software pairs text and creates a transitional representation from which the text in the target language is generated. This process requires extensive lexicons with morphological, syntactic and semantic information and large sets of rules. The software uses these complex rule sets and then transfers the grammatical structure of the source language into target language. Translations are built on dictionaries and sophisticated linguistic rules. Users can improve the out-of-the-box translation quality by adding their terminology into the translation process. Now, statistical machine translation technology. Statistical machine translation utilizes statistical translation models whose parameters stem from the analysis of monolingual and bilingual corpora. Building statistical translation models is a quick process, but the technology relies heavily on existing multilingual corpora. A minimum of 2 million words for a specific domain and even more for general language are required. Theoretically, it is impossible to reach the quality threshold, but most companies do not have such large amounts of existing multilingual corpora to build the necessary translation models. Additionally, statistical machine translation is CPU intensive and requires an extensive hardware configuration to run translation models for average performance levels. Now, let us conclude our discussion. In this conclusion of this discussion, I would like to quote a famous translation studies theorist and translation studies scholar, Mark Newman, who rightly puts, translation has its own excitement, its own interest. A satisfactory translation is always possible, but a good translator is never satisfied with it. It can usually be improved. There is no such thing as a perfect, ideal or correct translation. A translator is always trying to extend his knowledge and improve his means of expression. He is always pursuing facts and words. Now let us summarize our discussion. That through this discussion we come across different types of translation, different method of translation, and we came to understand that we are surrounded by work of translation. We read a famous text of world literature or famous text of Indian literature. It is a product of a written translation. If we have a survey about Indian tribal literature and Indian folk literature and Latin American tribal literature or African literature, we can understand that there is a continuous process of translating oral tradition into a written script, into a written form. That is why we get great books of oral or folk tradition, folk literature, and this is how we can have documentation of years old, age-old oral traditions. And now in this age of globalization and market economy, we have immense use of machine translation, different kinds of machine translation. Every day we observe different kind of advertisements in regional language. What a result of the corporate translation. We use the legal terms in everyday life, and that is a result of legal translation. And there is machine translation and applied linguistic which develop the machine translation results and the process of machine translation, what we come across in rail station or airport or different uses of our everyday life. Thank you.